Cool. Well, looks like we have some folks joining us, so let's go ahead and get started. For you guys, if this is your first time joining us, welcome to SpeedBumps Live. And this show is a weekly web series that we're going to start doing every Friday. And what we're doing is we're talking to marketing leaders and looking at challenges and opportunities, everything from technology heavy, from esports like we saw us talk last week, to today, which we're really going to talk about the future of publishing in advertising. So my name's Javier Santana, and I'm co-founder of Launch. And Launch is an experience design agency here in Atlanta. And then there's this guy.
Oh boy. Hey, happy Friday, everybody, or whatever day it is. I'm Paul Carpenter. I'm Director of Client Relations at Lion Star Films. We're a video production studio here focused on branded content and communications. But enough about us. Let's talk about this show. Let's talk about David here in a second. I know there's going to be a really fun story to kind of kick us off with. But before we get into that, I want to mention that while we do have the chat feature off, we will be doing Q&A towards the end of this. But go ahead and start firing the questions there on your feet on the module below. And our guest moderator today is Taylor O'Quinn from Launch. Woohoo! And she's going to be selecting some questions for David from you all. So again, fire away. Thanks, Taylor, for joining us as well.
Yeah, awesome. So our guest for today is David Jaye, as you can see him here, right? So I've known David for a while. I'll tell you a quick little story. I met David because I heard him speak at an event, and he had some really great stories, and I basically chased him around for about 6 months to get coffee with him. Eventually, he gave me the time, and we chatted for a long time, and we've become buds ever since. But Dave, he's an entrepreneur. He's been on the SaaS side, so with software startups, 25 years experience between agency operations, marketing, and he even owned a successful burrito cart in San Francisco, which is one of my favorite stories. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But Dave, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you giving us the time. I know you're a busy guy.
A little less busy, I'll be honest. But yeah, no, I appreciate you guys having me on. I'd love to talk about this stuff. So from my standpoint, let's go ahead and kick it off and see what questions kind of come out the other end. And I'm looking forward to it. So
Awesome. Well, let's start off with a real quick question about your background. You started in marketing. You went from marketing to tech agency, and back and forth, and then you ended up, with Weather, IBM, and eventually now an advocate and really focusing on digital publishing side of the business and the future of. Tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today and what that journey looked like.
I think I'd call it failing forward, failing upward. No, I think a lot of what I've done has been driven a lot by curiosity. So I'm very interested in finding out ways to do things for things that maybe aren't able to be accomplished now. So for me, I was very lucky because I got into book publishing right out of college. And because of that, they basically established when you create a book based around a niche audience interest. So if you thought about the web then, great, it's hand-raising niche audience people that are joining mailing list news groups. So the way I got into the web was essentially creating websites to give away the first free chapter of books. And from that, I became part of a digital agency that we decided to do it for a whole bunch of other clients. That digital agency was acquired by a large advertising network. And then that really led me into my advertising marketing career, basically building digital competencies in large agency networks. And for me, it was always a graduating process. It was like, okay, I'm dealing with digital. Now I'm dealing with digital plus other channels. Now I'm doing it at a larger level. Now I'm creating businesses. So for me, it was a lot of stimuli in a lot of different ways. But I literally got to the point where I was like, okay, this isn't that much fun anymore. And it feels a little Groundhog Day. And the amount of sacrifice I was making against the impact to my family wasn't something that I was comfortable with. I was just always away. So my wife and I decided to concentrate having our second son. So we ultimately were living in Sweden. I was working for a large advertising agency. I took a year off, and my wife and I created a burrito cart, actually in the middle of Sweden. So it wasn't even San Francisco.
Oh,
but,
okay.
so we used, And the whole idea was to create something that was reflective on what we thought was important. So it wasn't like we're just changing up our career. This became an interesting thing from a business, from a brand, from a category concept, etc. We did that actually for 3 years because it did quite successfully.
The Swedes dig burritos is what you're saying.
Exactly.
What was the name of the company?
Log'em, so San Francisco style Log'em burrito. The Facebook page is still up if you're interested. Let me fast forward.
Quite interested.
Yeah. So a person who I'd worked with previously was working at Google and gave me the opportunity of joining Google out in San Francisco. So my claim to fame at Google is I'm the only one who previously was running a burrito cart in the middle of Sweden that was hired by Google. So that's my personal achievement.
They give you like an award or a badge for that, or you just hung it up in your office?
No, it was all me.
It was all you.
For me. I wore a chain around like burrito maker. Yeah, it was all me.
It's awesome.
Big jalapeno.
Yeah. So I got very much involved in using APIs to create products and service products. And then somebody else I'd worked for was over at the weather company, was the CEO there, and said, listen, we're looking for a CMO to build out our direct-to-consumer business, or a CMO, excuse me. And so I decided to take that opportunity because now I have a whole platform, so I could start implementing some of the things I found interesting and found effective. We were then acquired by IBM, where I worked on IBM's application of artificial intelligence to persistent chat tools. So it's how do you make your chatbot smarter? Yeah. And then from IBM decided I want to do something more entrepreneurial again. So I went into a SaaS platform that can refactor code. And so started that business, and that business is currently going well. I consult on the side for Bain. And then also, and I think we'll touch upon this, I've been particularly focused on the ad-based publishing models and helping some of those companies start to come to grips with having to take a product mindset and diversified revenue streams.
Yeah.
So that's really where I'm focused.
That's actually a perfect segue because when we talked the other day, you really kind of level set everything. And so for our audience out there who might be in the publishing space, can you talk a little bit about how what your approach is to solving problems with ad publishing and help just kind of define some differences and challenges?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I find this space both like scary and huge with opportunity. So really I'm focused on publishers and broadcasters and content creators that are completely and utterly dependent on ad-derived revenue. So ad-derived revenue is every time you show a page, you show an advertisement on that page.
Right.
And before even the coronavirus hit, there was a lot of headway for publishers in that way. People were moving to mobile. So then all of a sudden the mobile, the banner ad doesn't matter, doesn't get as much value as the desktop. So all of a sudden you have a huge depression based around that migration. You have the integrators or the aggregators now, the Google, so in the news category, Google News, Apple News, where they're disenfranchising or disintermediating the relationship between the consumer and the publisher, which can lead to commoditization. And then also you've got just this whole proliferation of fragmentation. So there's more and more every year opportunities to advertise.
Right.
And so from a mobile standpoint, you got to move to video because that's the only way you're going to be able to run pre-rolls. They're going to offset what you're going to lose from the desktop. So the biggest challenge is that there's forcing factors that are behavioral and consumer trends. At the same time, there's the inflexibility of the current publishing models to be able to move off of that ad-based revenue. And now you add coronavirus in, and oh my God, the spigot just stopped.
Right.
So, fund it. So just as an example, I work for a very large network, and right now they're doing amazingly well as far as page views, but their actual ability to sell through to advertisers, meaning to be able to book advertisers, is less than 20%. So that means 80% of the ads that they're having to show on more and more pages are losing them more and more money.
Right.
So, so there's a considerable amount of need for transition quite quickly into diversifying revenue, being able to create a product approach that creates opportunity cost. So there's kind of a methodology that I've kind of approached before, and we can certainly get into that if that becomes relevant. But
yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting, right? Because now what ends up happening is that you have all this empty real estate, so to speak, right? Because nobody's really advertising it, right? Then you have a specific type of demand. How do you solve for that, right? Unless you're really talking about going a little deeper into, and I know we'll talk a little bit about personalization, but what you don't want is repeat billboards on every single page that you go through, right? Because you lose credibility and interest from the end users. But how do you solve for that gap?
Well, I think, so just taking a step back, if we just follow the money for a moment, the money is what's going to drive the effort of an organization. So if I make money off of ad volume, I'm going to create product that creates volume. I think it's understanding that model is under places it's imminent. So local news publishers, they may not come out of this with the ability to stay in business because they're the ones who are very much getting squeezed. So there's a whole aspect of the local publisher. And then the other aspect is really around the ability for large networks to start to look at their market as being an addressable market versus an unaddressable market. So an addressable market is, the same thing you do for TV subscription. You sell subscription.
Yeah.
But for most companies, you can't get there right away. So a lot of it has to do with kind of a progression, as simple as it may sound. It's create incentive as to why people would want to register with you, register with them. And then every time I come to that site, me, make it a little bit more efficient for me to find what I want, even if I don't know what it is. And then, oh, by the way, we can grab those into segments. Instead of selling advertisers a volume play, we can sell them segments because we know who these people are at a more premium. So you start to break the volume down. At the same time, if you're creating customization, so a la Spotify is not creating any content. They're just curating, I would say 80% of what we're already telling them. So, but the point is, I'm not going to move from Spotify because I would have to put all that effort in another platform based around my idea of what I've put into this platform. So it's the Facebook approach. But in order to do that, you have to create a customized functional experience that drives that. So
yeah. And sorry to cut you off here, but you've mentioned customization a couple of times here. And I'd really like to I like to backtrack and keep it simple for me because I'm the least smartest person in the room. How's the debate between personalization and customization? And
sure.
Hey, let's define that and then talk about a little bit, because you mentioned this the other day and I really liked your approach to this.
No, I appreciate that. And if you're the dumbest person in the room, then the bar is set very low, my friend. Very, very, very low. And I didn't mean that I meant
no. Nothing can stop me, man. I've got my surfer shirt on today. I'm good.
Yeah, Miami Vice look going on today.
So in my experience, so from a sort of, it's almost like the sort of golden chalice here, right? I've been hearing about personalization forever,
right? Okay,
since the web started. And the inability of being able to provide that as a concept I can understand is something that's personalized. Well, is Spotify personalized for me? No, it's probably customized for me. But is it individually in my head and being able to give me things and discover things? And that's their biggest challenge right now, is discovery, right? So people don't want to just see what they think they want to see. They also want to discover things. So when I look at it as personalization, not an end state, which a lot of people sort of about, like once we can personalize, will be great. Okay. I kind of look at it as a progression of steps. And, you know, in order to personalize, or in order to get to personalization, which I don't think you can ever achieve, you've got to be able to, customize. So the whole idea here is don't try and shoot for this ultimate goal of perfection of personalizing for me. Just make it customized so that every time I come, it is a little bit more efficient than the time before in me finding the things I want to find and the things I didn't know I want to find. So my whole point is, like, every time I go, it should be better and better for what I want to accomplish. Now, you don't need to know my name. You need to, you need to know data around me. And that's why thinking about registration as a component of that. But again, people tend to think of that as a strategy, where actually the first step is you got to create value for why someone wants to register. Then you need to understand who they are to be able to then customize the functional experience, not just the content editorial experience. So that tends to be how I kind of look at it, is customization is a journey and it's constant.
Right.
Personalization tends to be, in my view, an albatross at times. So it stops people from doing anything, because if they can't do full personalization, they feel, we're not doing it. So, like, why do just little bits of it?
Yeah. So would you argue that most companies need to stick with customization and kind of get that almost iterative, or helping, kind of help that journey along?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
and don't get paralyzed by personalization.
Well, it's analysis paralysis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my whole thing is that the only way in which you can introduce a voice that is not subjective is to execute and get the feedback, is to get the metrics. Because what happens in a lot of organizations is, without that execution to get that feedback, everyone has an opinion of one. So what starts to get built starts becoming this Frankenstein a little bit, because marketing's like, well, what could you do with me there? And sales is like, what about me?
Right.
Ops are like, I need to do this. Data intelligence is saying, I want this. So these things become, so my big approach, and that's why customization is a critical, is we execute, we iterate, we learn, we execute, we iterate, we learn. And we have things called decision meetings. And those are literally meetings to just make decisions. So everyone comes to the meeting with a decision that needs to be made, and has a certain period of time to represent why that decision needs to be made and what the options are. So, like, I think there's a dual thing, and both of those are organic. I mean, not organic, but they both have to be executed and iterated on. So that's why, for me, we could get to personalization, although every time I ask it, what does that actually mean from an experience standpoint? Like, how do you map that back to features and functions? And I tend to find that is a bit blurry. And so I like customization because you can iterate and keep going.
Let me interrupt
and
you.
It's not about waiting for analysis paralysis, which is trying to make it perfect.
Yeah, let me interrupt you for a second, Dave, because you said something interesting, and I want to cycle back to when we started talking about mobile. I'm a huge fan of targeted advertising, right? I want people to know me. I don't want you to send me diapers. I don't have an infant. So just the idea of really getting solid targeted advertising is really important to me as a consumer, because, as you're flipping what they call a thumb stopping content, as you're swiping through your phone, something catches your attention, you want to stop. Now, one of the frustrations as a consumer is that if I'm on Instagram and I get a targeted ad, I'm happy. I may interact with that. If I get something I don't like or I don't want to interact with, I will actually take the time to let them know that I'm not interested in this type of advertising. And you have some companies that are not really doing anything with that information except, Paul no longer wants to receive diapers, so let's send him baby bottles instead, right? So the idea is, well, maybe you do, Paul. I don't know, dude. That's your thing. Let's not get into that. But the idea is that if we're really talking about having companies go deep into the customization process, then there's a gap right now that I believe is missing for most companies, is that they're getting information from you. right? Because like you mentioned, the Spotify model, you're interacting. I'm letting you know what I like. All you really have to do is curate based on my interest, right? But that part, that curate based on your interest, I feel like that's not really happening in a lot of places. I'm investing the time to let you know what I like, but you're not giving me anything in return, just more shit.
But I think, if you look at the CNNs, if you look at the NBCs, if you look at the big guys, that's exactly the point. Exactly the point is they don't customize for me. Okay. Like I just go there and it's like, I'm just seeing the front page of a newspaper. And I think a lot of that is because the simplest way for funding to drive the internet was advertising based. So, when you think about it from that standpoint, it's not only the ability for them to, be able to functionally deliver that experience, it's also their ability to sell it on to advertisers.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're going to go down the advertising model in parallel to a customization subscription model, then what you can do is you can increase the premium that you charge on those groups. And for the people like NBC's, CNN's, Fox, all the rest, you're talking about like huge audience sizes. We're talking billions of users, within a 3-month period of time. I mean, it's insane. So I think you're absolutely right. I think right now, no one's really doing it to the degree that news could be done. And some would suggest the only places are the aggregators or the big tech companies who are continually trying to fix their algorithm to get you more and more stuff you're interested in.
Well, and to that, aren't those aggregators in some way making you feel like you're customizing?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
The most beautiful thing is change one thing on the page.
Right.
And then change 2 things on the page. And then change 3 pages. It's literally that simple to define yourself. I think also in a lot of the news business in particular, editorial is completely proprietary over this notion that, I don't necessarily want to be told how it's performing. Because for me, I just want to get the news out that matters. I don't care about the commercial side of it. But now they're being brought in. But part of that is it's hard to lose that. And you never lose your integrity, but it's hard to deny the audience anymore their ability to give you feedback.
Yeah.
And that is, if they're not watching it and they're not seeing it, then they're not interested as much as you think it's an interesting story. And that's a hard truth.
Real quick, sorry, Jav, you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
We're talking about news and some of these outlets, and obviously the numbers are flying through the roof with everybody tuning in. With news, and we're traditionally, or in this conversation, we've been talking about digital, but digital, as we know, is taking over from a broadcast standpoint, traditional broadcast. So let's talk a little bit about a conversation we had earlier that is introducing some more traditional digital components like CRM and how that actually plays into a more traditional broadcast model.
Well, I think, so the broadcast model is based around volume. You put something up, you create audience, and your hypothesis is that audience is worth X amount to those advertisers. That's essentially an unaddressable market. You know nothing about them.
Right.
Okay? That same thing was approached in the way most publishers approached online. And what they did is they recreated the models that were successful for them. So the New York Times did an amazing job of creating a subscription model. Okay, you had the Washington, the Post doing the same thing, and that's because they had a legacy of subscription. But then you had places that couldn't transition, like if you remember Newsweek, like these incredibly strong subscription models that never migrated over. And I think you see the same thing with broadcast because of fragmentation of platforms. Like if they don't move into OTT, which is over the top boxes, which has a much more like flat distribution component to it, plus the market's addressable. then, you know, if you're able to do that, the question is, how do you actually create a back-end system that allows you to manage those interactions? So if I know who you are, what do I then do with that? Well, if I'm a traditional publisher, what I may do with that is just keep it as a target list for promotions. The other way of using it is to actually connect their multi-device engagement. So instead of looking at things as a single channel, it's looking at the customer journey. And I think what broadcasters are wrestling with is how to change their online model to match the demands of what people are looking for in both functionality and differentiation to their, you know, linear models. Was that helpful?
Yeah. Are there any examples of anyone out there you see doing it right?
Sure. I think that there are places that are doing it better.
Or better, there you go.
Yeah, and places that are kind of doing it, I wouldn't say as better, as well. I think the more success that you've had in your old model, the less likely you are to make change now. Like, you'll talk about it, you'll say it, you'll PR it, but you actually have no incentive to change. And that takes kind of strong leadership. I think that without naming sort of complete names, what I would say is that the companies that have a functional reason to be in someone's life, so like the weather company, they have a balance between product and editorial. And they understand the context around how people are trying to make decisions. So it's not just the content that they're putting out there, it's also trying to drive that you can make the right decision based around weather. So that to me was always but that was very specific to the fact of what the functional fulfillment was of what weather was within people's lives. I think you have an irony. I think you have aggregators who are doing it best because they're just coming at it completely from a digital view. And they're basically just serving as a platform. They don't own any of the publishers. Do you know what I mean? And the publishers find themselves in a very difficult spot because a lot of their traffic is coming from aggregators.
From that, yeah.
So they can't shut them off. So this is where I'm talking about, like, there's no one group that's doing it super well. And, you know, for the ones who have survived so far, the ability is local news. And I got involved in sort of this type of publishing and news, you know, as one component, because I strongly believe in the need of journalism. I think we strongly need voices, and we need local voices as much as we have syndicated voices. So if I live in a tiny town, say I grew up in Andover, Mass, I'm really worried about what's happening in Andover. And if there's not local coverage of that, and, you know, COVID, you know, disaster is a perfect example of it. Doesn't matter to tell me what's happening in Boston. I need to know what's happening in our town. So I guess, you know, the need for localized seems to have grown, but the ad-based revenue models make no sense. The economics will never support it, particularly if you're print. So I think for every local publisher, they just have to go digital. I don't think you can afford to stay print anymore, because they were already, you know, they were challenged to begin with, because once they lost any type of want ads, you know, they lost a huge amount of revenue. Anyway, I'm kind of going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but
no, it's really interesting, because it does make sense. You talk about digital and print. Two things. So I have like three things to say, man. I swear to God, I won't take a lot of time here. But every time you start talking, I have like questions that keep popping up in my head. I'll leave some for the audience.
Like, what is he saying? Why is he saying that? Exactly. No,
when are we getting our burritos?
I get that a lot. Okay, I get that a lot.
No, this is interesting. So one of the things I was going to mention is that somebody mentioned to me yesterday that Curved is actually going to stop publishing, right? One of the main reasons that they're going to stop publishing, obviously, is because they can't sell ad revenue, and they're just going to have to do some furloughs and things of that nature, which is a really terrible thing to hear. And they are very digital, right? I mean, this is a digital publication. But one of the things I wanted to ask about, I mean, definitely let's talk about that for a second. Yeah. What I really wanted to circle back to is that you talk about the customer journey. And that's a pretty broad statement, right? Because in our world, in digital, customer journey means a lot of things. We're really talking about pre and post engagement and everything in between. In your experience, when it comes to that consumer journey, where do you feel that the biggest gap is? Like, where is it that they're missing the mark? Because it's obvious if they weren't missing the mark, we would have full customization. Where is it falling apart?
I think, in my humble opinion, I think number one, if people do collect data, they don't know what to do with it. So, that currency exchange isn't working. So what's happening, it's becoming a kind of black hole. So people are submitting data and they're not necessarily, and I think that's a big issue, is not having some type of discipline within your organization that's connected to product, connected to editorial, or connected to the content creators that starts to help them contour this to that data. So I think there's a whole data enablement thing that's a challenge, and you see that with sports teams as well. They're so focused on ticket sales that they haven't done a lot of customer relationship components, and they're advertising based as well. So when they can't sell tickets and they can't sell major sponsorships, so it's not just limited to publishing, it's really every ad derived entertainment content creator that gets the majority of its revenue through advertising. That whole spigot is just stopped.
Right.
So I think there's that component. I think also there's still very much organizations that reflect its organizational structure out, and they don't have cross incentives. So if I'm on TV, if I'm online, if I'm on my app, if I'm on, one of my syndication partners, I want to know that. I want to be able to understand that that's where you're consuming, and that seems to be your pattern of consumption. Right now, we have very much a channel focus, which kind of reflects that organizations set it up with a channel focus.
Right.
And so even in many situations, you have digital revenue that's completely disconnected from the linear revenue. So there isn't a lot of incentive overlap. So that to me is the big missing thing. It's, all these people trying to connect your experience, and both either technologically it's not quite there, or legacy institutionally within the company, there's no real wherewithal to get there. Or the third component, which is generally the one that I get most concerned about, is it's become a monstrosity of a project that will never do anything really right.
Right.
We'll do a lot of things, but at some point, so the third component is I see these become these huge initiatives that never actually work themselves through. So I think it's a combination, and all that comes back to leadership. It comes back to the direction that the company's being set. And this is very challenging time. The industry is very challenging for any senior exec.
Right.
But then in the current context, it's, you got to feed to keep the lights on, but at the same point, you got to transition. So how do you look at that capital cost? So, a lot of it is, and again, that's where a product focus comes in, which is in waiting for a full platform to be ready, iterate.
Yeah,
and
that's great.
And build that along with your audience.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, create some way of them for registering. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you the interesting thing about that, right, is because based on what you're talking about and the monstrosity of projects and letting them sit on a shelf and collect dust, I mean, isn't that what just happened with the whole digital transformation movement, right? There was.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. I apologize.
No, really, that was it.
No, I think, digital transformation is so right now the biggest buzzword is in the sort of broadcast world is addressable TV. So literally you put that in any meeting, you're getting a promotion. Okay, you just put the word addressable TV in any conversation, you're set for at least as long as that.
Nice.
I think digital transformation was a very easy umbrella for people to try and describe something very complicated.
Right.
And so, for me, it's a bit of a misnomer, or it's one of those terms that people talk about. When you actually look at it and you say, okay, well, what are you actually trying to solve? It's less about digital transformation. It's more about business evolution.
Yeah.
So it's not this, we got to blow up everything and, just move from all dogma, all learnings, and just, started from a brand new approach. It's no, you have to evolve the business. And the idea is that the business keeps evolving so it never has to transform again.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah.
So I think it's really how organizations look to do it. And, you know, my last point is that if you ever wanted to find, so I view organizations as collectives of individual motivations, right? So if I get my bonus, that's where I'm going to be driving to. I mean, just to be very pragmatic about it. So if I'm incentivized to do a particular behavior, I will do that behavior. Unless you change my incentive, I will never change that behavior, because it's not going to reward me in what's important, which is making sure I can provide for my family, making sure I can do the things that I think are impacting in a positive way. Like, so yeah, I think to me, that's one of the biggest challenges, is organizations understanding that you can't just go out with an agile playbook.
Right.
You've got to change the incentive to reward good behavior. And then you execute as small as you can, as de-risked as you can, to get something up.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really good way to kind of sum it all up. Wow. I'm going to stop asking questions because I see we do have several. So I want to kick it over to Taylor. Taylor, you want to run through a couple? And
yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thanks, David. Thanks, Jav. Thanks, Paul. And thanks to everyone who asked a bunch of awesome questions. I know that we won't be able to get to all of them, but really appreciate everyone giving these questions. So starting off with a very serious one that a handful of folks have asked. Are blue shirts required to be on SpeedBumps?
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah. It's all branding, right?
Yeah. No. So casting is key and wardrobe is key.
Yeah. It's
now you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So the next one from an anonymous user here, David, they wanted to know, how do you make a complicated idea simple to sell in? And what's a good example of this in your past?
Sure. It's a great question. So I try to make it as simple as possible. So from my standpoint, I'm trying to think of a really good example. So a good example is, we had at the weather company, we were transforming the essential product to be digitally based, which meant that we could no longer rely on 15-minute or 30-minute intervals of updates coming from the local airports. So the whole idea became a threefold idea. It became 15. So it had to update every 15 minutes. It had to localize so that it was within the nearest possible sensor. And then number 3 is it had to reflect the location that you were in. And it had to do it in a way in which we would continually track that individual location. And so what we basically did is we said, like, listen, here are the 3 things that we're going to accomplish with this. And we started with that, and then we backed into the why. But we left it as essentially a one-sheeter. I've done the same thing with IBM. It's basically trying to distill it down so that your audience can understand the concept or can understand it, and then you can cascade them into whatever logic tree you need to build behind it. And I think in most of my situations, I've had to do that because in a lot, like almost everyone, because I'm tending to talk to a lot of different people who come from very, very different orientations. So I would say, number 1, know your audience. Number 2, understand where they're coming from. And then number 3 is try and envisage the cascade of questions. Like, you can't buy a car until you know the price. Well, hold it. We need to address that up front, because otherwise during the entire thing, you're going to be thinking, but I didn't get that. Like, but what about price? What about price? So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but that's the way I tend to look at it.
Yeah, no, that's great, David. Another really awesome question that we got is, are we giving too much credit to digital as the last mile from an attribution standpoint when traditional advertising and media is still impacting decisions? For example, like did you buy that Samsung phone because of the digital ad or the billboard, and stuff like that. And, you know, even though that sometimes Amazon might get the final purchase, the influence might come from all other touch points.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, so attribution and verification are two of the biggest issues. So verifying that an ad actually showed, and then also, you know, as you're talking about attribution, exactly to your point, because they're not addressable media. So when I see a billboard, you don't know that I've seen a billboard. You ask me afterwards, or you suggest that I did because that's my route. And what the attribution models seem to be is each one of these channels trying to claim credit. And to me, it's funny analytic models. It's like I could put anything in the analytic model and I could make attribution go one way or the other, because there is not complete